I think the timing and the seeming decision for the Russians to go after this offensive, despite not yet being fully prepared to their desired strength, is indicative of the Russians indeed wanted to seize the opportunity before the aid began to surge to the front. I think they expedited the timetables to try to make sure that they could get whatever they could, create whatever effects they're trying to create on the ground before the Ukrainians would be able to rebuff them. And there's a risk there, right? You take advantage of that opportunity when the aid situation and the material situation is worse for the Ukrainians, but you also take a risk in that your own strength isn't there. And that so far, it seems that gamble has not paid off for the Russians.
Hello and welcome to Frontline. Today with me, Alex Dibble, TimesRadio's Deputy Head of News. Today on Frontline, we're talking to George Barros, the head of the Russia team at the Institute for the Study of War. The ISW has become a go-to source for information about global conflict and is a respected authority on the war in Ukraine. George Barros, thank you so much for joining us on Frontline.
Thank you so much for having me, Alex. Good to see you again.
I thought we could start with the latest on the ground in Ukraine. We know Russia has been keen to make advances since the US aid package went through Congress. How much has changed since then?
Sure. I think we have to broaden the aperture in that case, going back to October, because in October 2023 is when it became clear to the Russians that the U.S. congressional debate on the supplemental aid would be a long, protracted, ugly affair. And that's when the Russians started cooking up a plan to try to exploit the situation that would inevitably occur when the aid would be delayed. Throughout the course of October up until about, I'd say, early May, we had the Russians conducting offensive operations in Avdiivka. We had the Russians setting conditions and that during that time redeploying significant forces to northeastern Ukraine, the border regions in Kursk and Bryansk and Belgorod Oblast to create this large operational grouping of about 30 to 50,000 soldiers. That is the group that then on May 10th, entered northeastern Ukraine with their renewed Kharkiv operation. That wasn't any sort of operation that the Russians decided to execute out of an easy opportunity or sort of a spur of the moment sort of thing. They set conditions and planned for that many, many months in advance. And that was, I think, it started to metastasize back in October. Concretely, since the Russians began their Kharkiv offensive on May 10th, the Russians have made very small tactical gains. You can go measure it on the map, but they've only penetrated, such and thus kilometers, not very far. They've lost a lot of forces, and they've been held up and pinned down in Vovchansk for a while. They've yet to seize the entire city, and Ukrainian forces have been conducting a series of tactical counterattacks to try to improve their tactical positions within the city. The Russians, nonetheless, they still maintain significant operational reserves for this operation. By our estimates, they've only committed about a third, maybe a little bit more of their prepared force for this operation. And the Russians absolutely maintain the opportunity to be able to intensify their operations. I'd note that, over the last 24 hours, the leader of Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov, just announced as of yesterday, June 9th, that some of his Chechen forces actually crossed the border from Kursk into Sumy Oblast, and they claim that they seized a border village. We need to verify those claims, but I would just add that it would be completely consistent with the Russian campaign design, which is the Russians seek to open up a series of fronts, put military pressure on the Ukrainians so that the Ukrainians then stretch themselves too thin across this whole theater of operations in order to generate opportunities and facilitate what could be some Russian breakthroughs in what we think is the priority area, eastern Ukraine.
And those developments that you've just described since the US aid package, have they been smaller tactical gains on Russia's behalf than you might have expected, or greater, or indeed exactly what you would have predicted?
Yeah, so I think the tactical gains around Avdiivka that especially occurred in April were concerning because it seemed like the Russians were able to actually exploit the fact that the Ukrainians there were underprepared under-equipped, and they managed to project west of Avdiivka at a rate that surprised me, faster than what I would have expected. But recently it's bogged down as the Russians have actually approached the main area where the Ukrainians have built their main line of defense just west of Avdiivka. So it was fast at first, but then it slowed down in a surprising way. With regards to the Kharkiv operation, that was very interesting. We were forecasting the Russians to actually start their Kharkiv operation much later than they actually did. The time window we were thinking that they would begin it would be late May or early June. They began it in early May on May 10. And also under strength. All the indicators suggested that the Russians wanted to create an operational grouping of about 50 to 100,000 forces, personnel for that operation. And they committed to it significantly under strength of that target, somewhere in the ballpark of 30 to 50,000, so about half. And I think the timing and the seeming decision for the Russians to go after this offensive, despite not yet being fully prepared to their desired strength, is indicative of the Russians indeed wanted to seize the opportunity before the aid began to surge to the front. I think they expedited the timetables to try to make sure that they could get whatever they could, create whatever effects they're trying to create on the ground before the Ukrainians would be able to rebuff them. And there's a risk there, right? Take advantage of that opportunity when the aid situation and the material situation is worse for the Ukrainians, but you also take a risk in that your own strength isn't there. And that so far, it seems that gamble has not paid off for the Russians.
Interesting. It's also been just over a week since the US changed its stance on Ukraine using donated weapons to strike targets inside of Russia in a limited way. How would you assess at this stage Ukraine's use of that permission? And has the US done enough, do you think, to change the situation on the front?
Yeah. So the best metric that we have for this is the performance of the Russian offensive in Kharkiv Oblast, which as of late May and early June has been pretty poor. And I think part of that is, in fact, that the U.S., the Biden administration, they made the decision to allow the Ukrainians to conduct some limited fires across the border at some Russian forces. It's an extremely important policy change. However, I want to highlight that it's actually a very, very small and very limited change. I think it was mischaracterized by most reports as being this monumental watershed moment for U.S. policy and is a real game changer for the war. And it certainly has the potential to be that. But at this stage, it really isn't. If you study the minutiae of the actual policy change, the Biden administration has allowed the Ukrainians to use a subset of weapons, the HIMARS Gimlers, the guided multiple launch rocket artillery, to strike targets that are actively attacking Ukraine in the vicinity of Kharkiv. The U.S. policy still does not permit the Ukrainians to use their most effective weapons that the U.S. has given Ukraine, ATACMS missiles that can strike into the operational rear and deep rear. I just published a map about this yesterday, but if you look on the map of concretely sort of what changed with the policy, you'll find that the sanctuary space that the Russians use to shield their forces has been decreased by at maximum 16%. That is to say, 84% of all of the shielded territory still remains. And unfortunately, it's not just about numbers. I think, when a commander is conducting operations and they're fielding hundreds of thousands of men and they're pushing a lot of material and fuel and lubricants and projecting into another country for operations, any commander has to make a choice between balancing two desirable things, economic efficiency and expediency versus protection. Crudely speaking, when you have a tank formation, you can drive it in a column. That is the one that that optimizes economic expediency and fuel efficiency, but it's dangerous because if you get caught with your pants down by the adversary, you're lined up and easy to be destroyed. The way that you would actually try to maximize protection would be you flare out, you go into line formation, you're dispersed, you move slower, but if you get engaged, you're prepared to handle that threat. Right now, this huge territory in the Russian Federation bordering Ukraine is optimized for economic efficiency. And my argument is that if the Biden administration follows suit, like many European states have now done, and remove all restrictions on what the Ukrainians are allowed to target in Russia, then it will force upon the Russian command to make difficult decisions. about to what extent do they reconfigure their rear and support areas in order to maximize protection, or at least improve protection in exchange for supporting at the expense of efficiency. Concretely, that'll have very important effects for Ukraine. Big ammunition depots will be partitioned and more sliced into a series of dispersed and small ammunition depots. Same for fuel. You won't be able to have big accumulations of your forces as far as deep. You'll have to stretch your interior lines further. And what we've seen is that the Russians perform a lot better when they have short interior lines versus long interior lines. It's also critical for the air operations that the Ukrainians are planning and the air capabilities they're trying to build. Russia has limited air defense and electronic warfare protection assets. And right now, the Russian command enjoys the luxury of being able to exclusively have to worry about protecting the frontmost areas of the theater in Ukraine. And they can really pile on all of their air defense assets in a very relatively geographically small area, as opposed to having to consider the need to deploy those inwards, rearray the way that they have these limited assets deployed to protect important and vulnerable targets in the rear. And if we can actually get the Russians to redeploy some of those air defense assets instead of being at the front to the rear, then that, of course, will make a better operating environment for the various different Western aircraft that are going to be going into Ukraine soon.
You mentioned a moment ago the air operations that Ukraine is planning as part of the defensive operations in the north of Ukraine. Ukraine has launched an airstrike using a Ukrainian Air Force jet for the first time against what's been called a Russian command node in Belgorod. How significant do you think that attack is?
Yeah, we're working on trying to see what kind of battle damage assessment we can clarify from the extent of that attack. But in general, I think it's very important. I think it's extremely important that we revisit collectively our assumptions about air power in this war. For the first 2.5 years of this war, really, air power has been sort of a secondary or tertiary afterthought when it comes to war. And a large part of that is because I think it actually stems from the sanctuary, right? We've assumed that the Ukrainians are not going to be capable of using air power the way NATO would use air power because the Russians have a very capable air force and they have a lot of air defense systems on the ground that we're not able to take out. And if we start to examine some of those assumptions, right, like why can't we take out the air defense systems? Well, it's because they're based on Russian territory. And we can't strike Russian territory. Well, if we check that assumption, it no longer is axiomatically impossible that using Scalp and Storm Shadows and ATACMS missiles, the Ukrainians could conduct a shaping operation that seeks to destroy Russian air defense systems, S-300s and S-400s, try to get the Russians to redeploy some of those from the front towards the rear to protect them. And then it's no longer sort of a crazy thought to say the Ukrainians can start building towards, over the course of many months and years, a concept of operations where you actually do have Ukrainian aircraft operating in the theater, conducting strikes, doing air-to-air operations, and supporting combined arms. I think this Ukrainian strike, if it's confirmed against the bunker node in Belgorod, that's going to be very important, and I hope it'll be the first heralding event for what will be a renewed series of Ukrainian operations in the air domain.
And there have also been reports over the weekend that Ukraine destroyed an SU-57 fighter jet. Can you tell us about those planes, and will that be a loss to Russia?
I think it's more of a prestige loss for the Russians because the Russians were very proud of their SU-57, fighter because it's supposedly a stealth aircraft. It's, fifth generation fighter. They cost a tremendous amount of money to produce and they're very difficult to produce. And it was sort of Russia's attempt to, be on par with the United States and its partners with the F-35 program. But, it was the SU-57 was never as good technically, and it was plagued with a bunch of R&D problems. Having the Ukrainians take out that aircraft, especially at the distance at which they did, over 500 kilometers away from Ukraine's international borders, that's quite significant. And I think it's just it's a testament to the Ukrainian deep strike capabilities, what the Ukrainians themselves independent of the West, are developing for their drone and missile program to strike sensitive military targets deep in Russia's interior. And I hope they continue with it.
And still on the subject of air power, in the last few days, we've seen France announce that it's going to send Mirage jets to Ukraine, and also train pilots. Are Mirage jets what Ukraine needs? How much will they help, do you think?
Ukraine needs everything that it can get. There's a massive bottleneck right now in terms of available airframes, but more importantly, pilots and training pilots. The U.S. is not able to rapidly train Ukrainian pilots for a variety of reasons. And so the faster that we can get more airframes in Ukraine up and running, the better. Standardization would be ideal. However, at the end of the day, the approach to supporting Ukraine has been sort of scrape the barrel, get what we can get, field it, and if we can generate some good effects with it, then proceed with it. Given the organic constraints on training and qualifying F-16 pilots, I think if there's a robust pipeline that we can try to get Ukrainian pilots trained on other airframes, that'll be important as well. I also read some reports that the Mirage jets are apparently going to be capable of firing scalp missiles, which is interesting. So we might potentially see some aircraft being used as part of a cruise missile campaign in order to strike sensitive Russian military assets within Russia, which is an important capability. I'd note that within ATACMS range and some Storm Shadow range, there's a number of Russian military air bases and airfields, and of course, I think what is necessary for the Ukrainians to defend themselves is to crater the runways and destroy a lot of those aircraft before they even get off the ground.
Mm-hmm. And again, you mentioned F-16s there. What stage are we at in terms of progress on those donated F-16s?
Yeah, so a bunch of Ukrainian, let me rephrase, a small number of Ukrainian pilots finished their training in Arizona on the F-16, and they're doing some more training in Europe now. All the timelines indicate that the first small batch of Ukrainian pilots, the F-16, should in principle be able to start operating sometime this summer. But I'd iterate that the number of pilots and the number of available airframes is very small at this point, that it's pretty symbolic, and it's not yet what's needed to create a capable combat unit like for example, a regiment or a squadron of a regiment of F-16s. I hope that over the course of several years, months and years, we can build to a larger capability where, again, the Ukrainians can operate pretty conventionally in the air war, but it's predicated on taking away the sanctuary in whole, taking out the air defense assets to make it a safer environment, training more pilots, getting them in there. And, this is, really the sanctuary is a game changer because now we actually can use air power. And there is I think there is a concept of operations where air power can re-enter and potentially be a really disruptive factor for how the Russians assume they would win this war.
Mm. Moving on from air power and air operations, let's talk a little bit about the sea operations again. As the ISW notes in its report, Ukraine has carried out another strike against Russia's Black Sea fleet. Do we know what ship was hit, and is this again a sign of Ukraine continuing to find ways, perhaps surprisingly, to hit Russia in the Black Sea with some success?
Yeah, over the last 72 hours, the Ukrainians have hit, I think, at least two naval vessels. They hit a patrol boat, and they hit one other craft, which is escaping my memory at this moment. But this is part of a sustained campaign that the Ukrainians launched back in summer 2023, targeting specifically the Black Sea Fleet and its surface vessels. And they actually even destroyed one submarine with long-range fires, as well as with surface and subsurface drones. It's been a very successful Ukrainian campaign, and it's had some very important effects. They've gotten the Black Sea Fleet to essentially redeploy most of its main combat elements from the main port in Sevastopol and Crimea to a worse and further away port on the Russian mainland near Novorossiysk. And it's degraded the Black Sea Fleet's ability to operate in the western part of the Black Sea. And this is important for a variety of reasons. We need to have those vessels out of the Black Sea if the Ukrainians are to become more active in the air domain. Many of those vessels have air defense assets. And there's also organic air defense assets of the Black Sea Fleet in Crimea that the Ukrainians have been striking. It's also important for our maritime security. It's important to keep those shipping lanes open so that the Ukrainians can continue to export grain to feed the world and also keep Ukraine's budget balanced. And it's been I think, it doesn't change the control terrain on the ground, but it really substantially degrades Russian naval capabilities. It hurts them where it hurts, and it's very impressive to see what the Ukrainians continue to pull off on a pretty regular basis. I feel like every time we see another report of a sunk vessel, it's sort of just like it melds with the mind. It's like this long list of just a series of continuous events of another ship being lost. It's no longer for me personally, it no longer seems like a spectacular event. It's just sort of like, oh, yep, another vessel lost. That basically tracks. So I should definitely be following it more closely personally.
Yes, I know what you mean. They've had so much success with it. It's almost their abilities are almost becoming. We take them for granted a little bit now, don't we? The ISW's recent report states that there are, and this is pertains to sort of recruitment and mobilization, I suppose, but there are an increasing number of foreign migrants in prisoner of war camps in Ukraine as a result of the recruitment drive from Russia among foreign workers, also among students. What do you think this tells us about the state of Russia's mobilization program and how their recruits are being used?
Sure. I'd like to give a little bit of a nuanced take here. I think some people tend to look at these anecdotes and say, the situation is super horrendous for the Russian military. They're scraping the bottom of the barrel. Things are super, super bad. And to a certain extent, I think there's a lot of truth in that. However, where, they are anecdotal, but it does tell us something about the Russian strategy for force generation and force reconstitution. This is part of the Russian approach to force generation. They have what we call a crypto mobilization campaign. And when I say crypto, because it's not like the mobilization that Putin declared in September 2022, where he suddenly mobilized 300,000 reservists in a very rapid period. That takes a lot of political capital, and Putin really doesn't have a stomach for doing that sort of mobilization when he can help it. And so instead, in order to maintain the tempo of operations, the Russians have established this really pervasive and insidious decentralized method of generating recruits. They go to companies, they go to government organizations, they go to state-owned enterprises, they go to regional governors, they go to civil society organizations, and they essentially say, hey, generate men. Sort of like, not just too dissimilar, this is a bit of a crude example, but not too dissimilar to like how a feudal lord in the Middle Ages would go to all of the fiefs and basically talk to the lord of that fief and say, we're running a campaign, give me what you have, and then we're going to go and fight our adversary, right? The Russians are doing the same there. And naturally, when you recruit from employers and state-owned enterprises and government institutions, and you say, hey, over this next recruiting period, I need you to send me 500 men. Inevitably, especially when the Russians have taken in so many migrant workers, the Russians, for example, now they have a labor deficit of, I think, 5 million workers or so, which they're trying to fill in with migrant workers from Central Asia. You inevitably are going to end up with these economically vulnerable people being seduced by the promise of high wages and supposedly good benefits just for fighting in Ukraine. And then they end up in the recruitment pool, and then they also end up as people that are killed in action and prisoners of war. And so when we see these sort of examples, I think it's indicative of really the system that the Russians have built to try to sustain the effort. I do think it is fairly robust. I think that they can continue to sustain the operations. The current estimates suggest the Russians recruit between 20 to 30,000 volunteers, such volunteers per month. And they get about 15,000 or so into combat roles per month. The other half essentially serving as rear echelon support and combat service support. I think the Russians basically they figured out a way to make it work, but it does result with a sort of strange, not particularly cohesive mishmash of a variety of people with different training, and the sort of the concept of there being a cohesive, cogent, professional Russian military that is uniform and have standardized training, like that concept is gone. Instead, they've decided to go with this massed amalgamation.
Mm. I thought we'd end by talking briefly about Moldova. The ISW has reported, and we've known for a long time, about Russia seeking to gain influence in Moldova, and even suggestions that they might be looking to invade Moldova in the future. But your organization has also reported recently on increased interference in Moldovan democracy. How concerned should we be about these most recent of developments?
Yeah, so Moldova is an interesting country because it's part of the former Soviet Union, and therefore Putin sees it as rightful Russian territory on par with Ukraine. It's difficult for the Russians to operate in Moldova though because it's landlocked. It's surrounded on one side by Ukraine on its eastern border, and then sandwiched with Romania um, on the west, and there's no access via sea or international airspace. So it's difficult for the Russians to get stuff in and out of Moldova. But the Russians do have some limited but important bases of power in Moldova, and those are 3 battalions that they have in the easternmost separatist but de facto Russian-controlled region of Moldova, Transnistria. And then there's a variety of different political actors and Kremlin political proxies whom the Kremlin finances and controls in Moldova. And what the Kremlin's trying to do is they're trying to sabotage what the current president of Moldova, Maya Sandu, is trying to do with European Union integration. Maya Sandu, she seeks to bring her country into the EU, and most Moldovans support that. However, there's this sort of political fifth column that is backed by the Russians. Ilan Shor and the Shor Party, the pro-Russian Kremlin-controlled party or pro-Kremlin party. And what they're trying to do is conduct a series of agitations and political sabotage movements in order to try to delegitimize the Sandu government and attempt to really sabotage the EU integration. Moldova is going into presidential elections in October of this year, 2024, and the Shor Party is already doing their best to set the informational conditions for what's going to be their effort to try to, essentially say, Moldova's lost sovereignty. This is another example of the hegemonic and evil Western imperialist powers trying to subsume elements of really Eastern Europe and bring it into its anti-Russian project. Moldova shouldn't be part of the European Union. Moldova should instead seek peace and prosperity by joining the Russian sort of bastard replication of what the EU is, the Eurasian Economic Union. And that's how Moldova is going to be successful. And recently we just saw a bunch of senior Moldovan influencers visit St. Petersburg for the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, which was last week. And they were talking about, the way that the current Moldovan government is oppressing them and regulating them and essentially setting and, priming the pump for these operations they're going to try to do. It'll be very interesting to see what happens in these upcoming fall elections. Moldova is a battleground state, but thankfully it's relatively difficult for the Kremlin to do a whole lot there. Their levers of influence are limited, but of course that's because a lot of the Kremlin administrative capacity is tied up in the current war in Ukraine.
George, as always, fascinating to get your thoughts and these updates from the Institute for the Study of War. So we appreciate your time very much. Thank you again for joining Frontline.
Thanks for having me, Alex. Always a pleasure.
Thank you for watching Frontline from Times Radio, the interview series bringing you expert analysis on the world's conflicts, particularly the war in Ukraine. For more, you can listen to Times Radio. You can also go to the Times website, take out a digital subscription, and have access to all the reporting done by our foreign correspondents in Ukraine and indeed elsewhere around the world. And also listen to the Times' World in 10 podcast every day. We take you through the latest developments all in 10 minutes. That's the Times' World in 10 podcast. Thank you very much indeed again for watching Frontline from Times Radio.